The afternoon sun cast gentle shadows across the vicarage lawn in Little Wickham, where the annual church fete proceeded with the quiet efficiency that marked all proper English social gatherings. White linen tablecloths fluttered softly in the summer breeze, laden with homemade preserves, delicate sandwiches, and the finest china the parish could muster. The air hummed with genteel conversation, punctuated by the distant laughter of children and the soft clink of teacups against saucers. Miss Jane Marple sat contentedly beneath the spreading branches of an ancient elm, her knitting needles moving with practiced rhythm as she worked on what appeared to be a christening shawl. Her mild blue eyes, however, were far from focused solely on her handiwork. Instead, they moved with subtle attention from one cluster of villagers to another, observing the intricate social dance that unfolded before her with the same careful interest a botanist might give to studying the growth patterns of particularly fascinating specimens. The centerpiece of this year's fete was undoubtedly Mrs. Cordelia Ashford's lace-making demonstration. Mrs. Ashford had arrived in Little Wickham some 6 months prior, taking the small cottage on Mill Lane and quickly establishing herself as a master of the ancient art of bobbin lace. Her stall, positioned prominently near the refreshment tent, displayed an exquisite collection of collars, handkerchiefs, and doilies, each piece a testament to hours of meticulous labor and rare, almost forgotten skill. Mrs. Ashford herself was a woman of perhaps 60 years, with prematurely silver hair and fingers that seemed to possess their own intelligence as they guided the delicate bobbins across her lace pillow. She had quickly become indispensable to several village committees, though Miss Marple had noted with interest that her integration into Little Wickham society had not been entirely without friction. "Such beautiful work," remarked Mrs. Dolly Bantry, settling herself into the chair beside Miss Marple with a small sigh of contentment. "Though I must say, there's been quite a bit of talk about Mrs. Ashford's methods. Some of the older ladies feel she's rather too modern in her approach to traditional patterns." Miss Marple's needles paused for the briefest moment as she observed a rather intense conversation taking place near the lace stall. Mrs. Beatrice Whitmore, the vicar's wife and unofficial social arbiter of Little Wickham, was speaking in low, urgent tones with Mrs. Ashford. The lace-maker's usually composed demeanor seemed strained, her pale complexion growing even whiter as she clutched a delicate handkerchief with trembling fingers. Across the lawn, Dr. Geoffrey Haydock was engaged in seemingly pleasant conversation with Colonel Melchett and young Timothy Fairfax, the bank manager's son who had recently returned from London with modern ideas about business and an unfortunate tendency toward a flashy waistcoats. Yet Miss Marple detected an undercurrent of tension in the way Dr. Haydock kept glancing toward the refreshment tent, and how young Fairfax's laugh seemed just a shade too loud, too forced. Near the cake stall, Miss Eleanor Vance, Mrs. Ashford's young assistant and pupil in the lace-making arts, was arranging a display of her own work with nervous precision. The girl possessed genuine talent, though her pieces lacked the masterful confidence of her teacher's creations. Miss Marple had noticed how Miss Vance's eyes often followed Mrs. Ashford with an expression that seemed to contain equal measures of admiration and something rather less pleasant. The peaceful afternoon atmosphere was enhanced by the gentle sound of the church bells marking the quarter hour, the distant bleating of sheep in the adjoining meadow, and the soft rustle of leaves overhead. Mrs. Whitmore moved gracefully among her guests, ensuring that teacups remained filled and that everyone felt appropriately welcomed and well-fed. Miss Marple's attention was drawn back to Mrs. Ashford, who had now moved to her lace pillow and begun a demonstration of her technique for a small gathered audience. Her fingers moved with mesmerizing precision as she explained the ancient patterns, the bobbins clicking softly as they crossed and recrossed in their intricate dance. "The secret of fine lace," Mrs. Ashford was saying, her voice carrying clearly across the small gathering, "lies not merely in the pattern, but in understanding how each thread must cross its neighbor at precisely the right moment. One careless move, one thread out of place, and the entire piece may be ruined." As she spoke, Her eyes seemed to fix momentarily on someone in the small crowd, and Miss Marple noticed a slight tremor in the lace-maker's usually steady hands. The demonstration continued, but there was now a subtle tension in Mrs. Ashford's voice, as though she were speaking of more than merely lace-making techniques. Mrs. Bantry had wandered off to examine the prize roses, and Miss Marple found herself with an unobstructed view of the entire scene. She observed how Miss Vance kept glancing nervously toward the lane that led to the village, how Dr. Haydock seemed unusually preoccupied, and how Mrs. Whitmore's smile had become rather fixed as she supervised the serving of refreshments. The demonstration reached its conclusion with polite applause, and Mrs. Ashford began to pack away her bobbins with careful precision. It was then that Miss Marple noticed the small, almost insignificant detail that would later prove so crucial. As Mrs. Ashford reached for her teacup, her hand brushed against one of her lace bobbins, and the delicate wooden implement rolled slightly across the table. Miss Vance quickly reached to steady it, but not before Miss Marple had observed the peculiar way the afternoon light caught what appeared to be a tiny, almost invisible modification to the bobbin's pointed end. The tranquil afternoon was shattered by Mrs. Ashford's sudden, sharp intake of breath. She had been reaching for her handkerchief when she suddenly stiffened, her eyes widening with what appeared to be surprise rather than pain. Her hand flew to her throat, and she made a small, puzzled sound as though she had discovered something unexpected. "My dear," Miss Marple began, half rising from her chair, but Mrs. Ashford was already swaying slightly, her face taking on an alarming pallor. The lace-maker's eyes sought Miss Marple's across the small distance between them, and in that brief moment there seemed to be a flash of understanding, as though she had suddenly comprehended the true nature of her situation. Mrs. Ashford collapsed gracefully into her chair, her head tilting to one side with an almost peaceful expression. Her hands, those remarkably skilled hands, lay still upon her lace pillow, the bobbins scattered like fallen leaves around them. Dr. Haydock was beside her in moments, his medical training overriding the social paralysis that had gripped the other guests. He checked her pulse, examined her throat, and then stepped back with the grave expression that Miss Marple had seen too many times before. "I'm afraid Mrs. Ashford has passed away," he announced quietly to the stunned gathering. "It appears to have been very sudden." But Miss Marple, who had observed the entire sequence with her characteristic attention to detail, had noticed the tiny puncture mark just below Mrs. Ashford's left ear, barely visible but unmistakably deliberate. She had also observed how one particular lace bobbin lay apart from the others, its pointed end catching the light in a way that suggested it had been put to a use far removed from the creation of delicate patterns. As the peaceful village fete transformed into a scene of shocked confusion and whispered speculation, Miss Marple continued her knitting with steady hands, her mind already beginning to work through the implications of what she had witnessed. In her long experience, she had learned that the most shocking crimes often grew from the most ordinary circumstances, and that the threads of murder, like those of the finest lace, required patience, precision, and a thorough understanding of how each element must cross its neighbor at exactly the right moment. The lace-maker's secret, whatever it might be, had died with her. But Miss Marple suspected that the pattern of guilt and deception that had led to this moment was far from complete, and that several more threads would need to be carefully examined before the true design would become clear. The peaceful afternoon transformed into something altogether different as word of Mrs. Ashford's sudden death rippled through the remaining guests with the peculiar mixture of horror and fascination that accompanies unexpected tragedy. Mrs. Whitmore, displaying the composed efficiency that had made her indispensable to every village committee, began the delicate task of managing both the immediate crisis and the social complexities it created. She moved among the guests with quiet authority, suggesting that perhaps it would be best if people took a turn about the garden, while Dr. Haydock attended to the necessary medical formalities. Miss Marple observed how each person responded to the crisis, noting the subtle variations in shock, curiosity, and genuine distress that painted themselves across familiar faces. Young Timothy Fairfax seemed almost energized by the drama, his eyes bright with nervous excitement as he moved from group to group, already constructing theories about what might have caused such a sudden collapse. Miss Eleanor Vance had grown increasingly pale and appeared unable to look directly at her deceased teacher, instead focusing her trembling attention on carefully gathering the scattered lace bobbins from around the pillow where they had fallen like autumn leaves. Colonel Melchett, displaying the organizational instincts of his military background, had already dispatched someone to telephone the police station in the neighboring town, while Dr. Haydock knelt beside Mrs. Ashford with professional gravity. The doctor's expression grew increasingly thoughtful as he conducted his preliminary examination, his trained eye noting details that would escape casual observation. When Inspector Slack arrived from the county town, he brought with him the brisk efficiency that had earned him both respect and occasional frustration among those who preferred more gentle approaches to investigation. He was a man who favored direct questions and obvious answers, qualities that had served him well in most cases, but had occasionally led him to overlook more subtle complexities. After a brief consultation with Dr. Haydock and Colonel Melchett, Inspector Slack surveyed the scene with the confident air of someone who expected to resolve matters quickly. His preliminary questions were practical and straightforward. Had anyone noticed Mrs. Ashford seeming unwell? Had she mentioned any health concerns? Were there family members who should be notified? Miss Vance answered these inquiries with obvious difficulty, her voice barely above a whisper as she explained that Mrs. Ashford had seemed perfectly normal that morning when they had prepared the display together. However, Miss Marple noticed something interesting in the young woman's responses. When asked about Mrs. Ashford's background and family connections, Miss Vance's answers became notably vague, filled with phrases like, "I believe she mentioned," and "she seemed to suggest," rather than the definite knowledge one might expect from someone who had worked closely with the deceased for several months. Dr. Haydock approached Miss Marple as she continued her knitting, though her needles moved with less rhythm than before. "Quite sudden," he remarked quietly, settling into a nearby chair, though I must say there was something rather curious about her expertise with lace-making. I'd understood she was relatively new to the craft, yet her skill level suggested years of practice. This observation caused Miss Marple's knitting needles to pause momentarily. "How interesting," she murmured. I'd assumed from her demonstration that she had been practicing since childhood. Such accomplished hands usually take decades to develop. Inspector Slack was preparing to conclude his preliminary investigation when Miss Marple rose from her chair and approached the lace store with the gentle, somewhat hesitant manner that often caused people to underestimate her powers of observation. "Forgive me, Inspector," she said softly, "but I couldn't help noticing something rather unusual about one of Mrs. Ashford's lace bobbins. I'm quite ignorant about such technical matters, but there seemed to be something different about that particular one." Inspector Slack followed her gaze with barely concealed impatience, clearly viewing this as the kind of trivial detail that elderly ladies were prone to fixate upon. However, Dr. Haydock moved closer to examine the implement in question, his medical training making him more receptive to unusual observations. The bobbin that had caught Miss Marple's attention lay slightly apart from the others, and upon closer inspection, it did indeed appear different. The wooden tip, normally smooth and rounded for guiding delicate threads, had been subtly modified. Dr. Haydock picked it up carefully, holding it to the light with growing concern. "Most peculiar," he murmured. "This appears to have been sharpened, almost like a small needle. The tip has been weighted as well, hardly suitable for lace-making in this condition." Inspector Slack's expression shifted from impatience to sharp interest as he examined the modified implement. The implications were unmistakable. A sharpened, weighted wooden point, small enough to create a barely visible puncture, yet potentially lethal if it had been treated with some toxic substance and used with precision. Miss Vance made a small, strangled sound when she saw the bobbin in Dr. Haydock's hands. "That's one of Mrs. Ashford's special ones," she whispered. "She was very particular about them. No one else was allowed to touch them." "Special how?" Inspector Slack demanded, his notebook appearing in his hands with practiced speed. Eleanor's voice grew even quieter. "She said they were weighted for particularly delicate work, but I never understood why that one looked different from the others." She hesitated, then added reluctantly, "There was something else. Yesterday, Mrs. Ashford received a letter that upset her terribly. She read it and went quite white, then burned it in her cottage fireplace. When I asked if everything was all right, she told me not to be foolish and that some things were better left buried." Timothy Fairfax stepped forward, smoothing his waistcoat with nervous precision. "If I may clarify something, Inspector, I did approach Mrs. Ashford recently with a business proposition. A subscription service for her lace patterns. There's quite a market for authentic heritage designs, particularly abroad." She refused rather emphatically, saying her patterns were not for sale at any price. Mrs. Clegg, the postmistress who had arrived with the crowd of curious onlookers, cleared her throat meaningfully. "There was a gentleman asking after Mrs. Ashford this morning, Inspector. Tall fellow, well-dressed but with a scar under his left eye. Said he'd return later, though he never gave his name. Had a foreign way of speaking, if you ask me." Inspector Slack's pencil scratched rapidly across his notebook as these revelations accumulated. What had initially appeared to be a simple case of natural causes was rapidly developing into something far more complex. The modified bobbin, the mysterious visitor, the burned letter, and the commercial interest in Mrs. Ashford's patterns suggested a web of motives and opportunities that would require careful investigation. Miss Marple returned to her chair beneath the elm tree, her knitting resuming its gentle rhythm while her mind worked through the implications of what she had observed. In her long experience with human nature, she had learned that the most shocking crimes often grew from the most ordinary circumstances, and that the threads of guilt and deception, like those of the finest lace, required patience and careful attention to reveal their true pattern. The afternoon sun was beginning to cast longer shadows across the vicarage lawn, and the peaceful village fete had been transformed into the opening scene of what promised to be a most intricate mystery. Mrs. Ashford's secret, whatever it might have been, had died with her, but Miss Marple suspected that the pattern of events leading to her death was far from complete, and that several more threads would need to be carefully examined before the true design would become clear. The peaceful afternoon had transformed into something altogether different as Inspector Slack began organizing his preliminary investigation. The remaining guests clustered in small groups across the vicarage lawn, their earlier festive chatter replaced by the urgent whispers that accompany unexpected tragedy. Mrs. Whitmore moved among them with practiced efficiency, though Miss Marple noticed how the vicar's wife kept smoothing her apron with nervous gestures and casting anxious glances toward Mill Lane, where Mrs. Ashford's cottage stood silhouetted against the evening sky. The village gossip mill had already begun its work with characteristic speed. Mrs. Ridley, the butcher's wife, held court near the refreshment tent, her voice carrying clearly across the lawn as she expounded her theories to an eager audience. "Mark my words, it's poison on that bobbin," she declared with the authority of someone who had read every sensation novel in the lending library. That foreign smell Dr. Haydock mentioned, and the way she collapsed so suddenly. I always said there was something not quite right about Mrs. Ashford, keeping herself so private. Timothy Fairfax, overhearing these speculations, flushed crimson and attempted to defend himself against the implied accusations. "Preposterous suggestions," he protested to anyone who would listen. "I merely offered legitimate business opportunities." Mrs. Ashford's refusal was disappointing, certainly, but hardly grounds for such wild theories. Miss Marple observed these exchanges with quiet interest while her knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm. She particularly noted how Miss Eleanor Vance had withdrawn to the edge of the gathering, her pale face reflecting not merely grief but something approaching panic. The young woman's eyes moved constantly among the other villagers, as though she were cataloguing their reactions and calculating some private risk. Inspector Slack's decision to examine Mrs. Ashford's cottage came as the natural next step in his investigation. Dr. Haydock volunteered to accompany him, ostensibly for medical expertise, but clearly driven by curiosity about the afternoon's revelations. Miss Vance was invited to provide access and identify any irregularities, though her obvious distress made her a somewhat unreliable guide. Mrs. Whitmore suggested that Miss Marple might find the evening walk beneficial after the shock, a thoughtful invitation that allowed the elderly detective to observe with her characteristic attention to detail. The cottage on Mill Lane presented a picture of rural tranquility that had initially attracted Mrs. Ashford to Little Wickham. However, as they approached the front door, Miss Marple noticed subtle inconsistencies in its appearance of domestic peace. The climbing roses had been pruned with almost military precision, and the curtains were drawn with mathematical exactness, suggesting an occupant who valued control and privacy above neighborly openness. Inside, the cottage had been converted into a workshop where Mrs. Ashford conducted her lace-making business. Wooden frames of various sizes lined the walls, each supporting partially completed pieces that demonstrated remarkable skill. The afternoon light streaming through mullioned windows illuminated threads so fine they seemed ethereal, creating patterns that spoke of countless hours of meticulous labor. Miss Vance moved through the room with obvious familiarity, though her hands trembled as she touched various implements. "Everything appears exactly as we left it this morning," she murmured, her voice carrying uncertainty despite her words. Mrs. Ashford was extraordinarily particular about organization. Inspector Slack examined the room systematically, paying special attention to Mrs. Ashford's collection of lace bobbins arranged in careful rows within a specially constructed cabinet. Each implement was labeled according to its specific purpose and weight, but one space remained, conspicuously empty, clearly the position where the modified bobbin had normally resided. Miss Marple positioned herself near the window where light was strongest and resumed her knitting, though her eyes moved constantly across the room's contents. She observed how Miss Vance avoided looking directly at Mrs. Ashford's correspondence on a small writing desk, and noted that several displayed lace patterns bore striking resemblances to pieces she had seen in museum exhibitions, suggesting expertise that extended beyond contemporary craftsmanship. Dr. Haydock's examination of a small medicine cabinet revealed that Mrs. Ashford had been treating chronic insomnia and nervous tension with properly prescribed medications from the local pharmacy. The quantities suggested someone under considerable stress, though the reasons remained unclear. "Inspector," Miss Marple said quietly, "perhaps Mrs. Ashford's correspondence might provide insights into recent disturbances in her routine." Inspector Slack approached the writing desk with renewed interest, discovering among routine business letters an envelope bearing a London postmark from 3 days previous. Though empty, its return address had been partially torn away in what appeared to be a deliberate attempt to obscure its origin. Miss Vance grew visibly more agitated as the correspondence examination proceeded. "Mrs. Ashford was intensely private about personal matters," she said quickly. "She never discussed her life before Little Wickham. I assumed she preferred not to dwell on past difficulties." The investigation took a more serious turn when Inspector Slack discovered a small strongbox beneath Mrs. Ashford's bed. Its contents proved illuminating in disturbing ways. Along with modest cash holdings, there were newspaper clippings dating back nearly 2 years, all relating to thefts from museums and private collections. The stolen items were primarily historical textiles and lace pieces, and the thefts had occurred across England and the continent. More troubling still was a collection of photographs showing lace pieces that bore striking resemblances to items currently displayed in Mrs. Ashford's workshop. The photographs appeared to have been taken in museum settings, complete with identifying placards describing the pieces as rare examples of 17th and 18th century craftsmanship. Dr. Haydock examined the photographs with growing concern. These pieces are virtually identical to several items I've observed in this workshop. Either Mrs. Ashford possessed remarkable skill at reproducing historical pieces, or she had access to original items through questionable means. Miss Vance had grown increasingly pale as these revelations accumulated. "I suspected something wasn't entirely proper," she whispered. "The patterns were too perfect, too authentic. And there were occasions when she received visitors late at night, people who never came during regular hours. She claimed they were collectors who preferred privacy, but I began to wonder about the true nature of these arrangements. The implications transformed the afternoon's tragedy into something far more complex than natural causes. Mrs. Ashford's expertise, her secretive nature, the modified bobbin, and evidence suggesting possible involvement in art theft created a web of motives that would require careful unraveling. Miss Marple continued her knitting as the investigation proceeded, her mild blue eyes registering every detail while her mind worked through the growing complexities. The cottage's peaceful exterior had concealed activities that reached far beyond Little Wickham's boundaries, and she suspected the afternoon's murder was merely the final thread in a pattern years in the making. Inspector Slack, following the threads of evidence with a dogged determination, stood with Miss Marple before the hearth in Mrs. Ashford's cottage. The ashes were layered, as if someone had tried to conceal the remains of something more than a simple fire. Miss Marple, ever unobtrusive, watched as Slack used the poker to gently sift through the debris. Amid the fragments, he unearthed a sliver of charred paper, faintly bearing the raised impression of a London address. Montague Street, a name that, to those with the right sort of curiosity, evoked the museum district. A slight foreign tang hung in the air. Dr. Haydock, peering over Slack's shoulder, remarked quietly, "That's not a scent I'd expect from coal or wood. Something sharper, almost chemical." It reminded him, he mused, of alkaloids from a laboratory. Miss Marple did not comment, but her eyes lingered on the oddly sweet odors. While the inspector busied himself with the letter, Miss Marple's gaze drifted to a lace pillow set apart from the others. Its seam was uneven, the stitches clumsy, a small detail, but as she well knew, such mistakes were telling. She suggested, with gentle apology, that sometimes people hide their secrets in places no one thinks to look. Slack, now more willing to trust her instincts, carefully opened the pillow. Inside, he found a narrow envelope bound with thread, a small brass key labeled 34B, and a soot-edged left luggage ticket from Waterloo Station. Eleanor Vance, watching the proceedings, turned pale. Her hands wrung the hem of her sleeve. "I never saw those before," she whispered, her voice brittle. "She never let me near her private things." Inspector Slack noted her distress, but pressed on. "You mentioned a visitor last night. Who was it?" Eleanor closed her eyes, recalling the scene. "I heard voices by the gate as I was leaving. A man, his voice low, urgent." Mrs. Ashford sounded angry. She said something about originals and replicas and told him he'd not bully her. Not now. I left quickly. I was frightened. Her confession seemed to cost her dearly, the burden of suspicion and fear weighing her down. As they prepared to leave, Miss Marple paused by the cottage window. She noticed the soft garden earth, recently pressed down. Caught on a rose thorn below the sill was a slender strand of silk, a brilliant shade of peacock blue. She remembered Timothy Fairfax's cravat at the fete. Too showy for the village, but perhaps not so rare in London. She tucked the thread away, a silent addition to a growing collection of secrets. Back at the vicarage, villagers whispered and speculated. Mrs. Whitmore arrived with a shawl for Eleanor, her hands deft but betraying a smear of beeswax at the thumb. A detail Miss Marple noted, though it could have come from any number of innocent activities at the fete. Inspector Slack, for his part, was left with a tangle of clues, a burned letter from the museum district, a key and a luggage ticket leading to Waterloo. chemical odors, coded hints of originals and replicas, and the question of who knew Mrs. Ashford's tools and her secrets well enough to turn a lace-maker's bobbin into an instrument of murder. The presence of the foreign visitor and the coded correspondence unearthed earlier pointed to pressures beyond the village, perhaps even to a criminal enterprise that had caught up with Mrs. Ashford at last. Miss Marple sipped her tea beside Eleanor. "She once told you that true lace has memory, didn't she?" Eleanor nodded, her grief mingling with fear. "Threads remember where they've crossed before," she murmured, "and you can't force them to a different pattern." Miss Marple smiled, the click of her needles resuming. "There is a good deal of truth in poetry, my dear, and in human nature as well." As darkness settled over Little Wickham, the investigators sealed the cottage, and the quiet of the village deepened. Behind drawn curtains and flickering lamps, secrets waited, some half-remembered, some fiercely guarded. And as Miss Marple walked home beneath the pale evening sky, she considered the evidence, the pattern of guilt and deception growing clearer, thread by thread, as each new detail found its place in the intricate design. The morning brought a peculiar stillness to Little Wickham, as though the village itself held its breath in the aftermath of tragedy. Miss Marple rose early, her sleep having been punctuated by thoughts of modified bobbins and peacock blue silk threads. From her cottage window, she observed Inspector Slack striding purposefully toward the railway station, the mysterious key and left luggage ticket secured in his coat pocket. His confidence suggested a man certain that London would provide the answers that Little Wickham seemed determined to conceal. Mrs. Bantry arrived with the morning post and intelligence that proved most illuminating. Her cousin Margaret, who worked in the textile department at the Victoria and Albert Museum, had provided disturbing information about recent thefts from private collections. "The most extraordinary thing, Jane," Mrs. Bantry explained as she settled herself in the morning room, "is that in each case, perfect replicas were left behind, so perfect that some collectors didn't realize their originals had been stolen for months." This revelation cast Mrs. Ashford's workshop in an entirely new light. Rather than simply receiving stolen goods, she appeared to have been the architect of an elaborate forgery operation, creating reproductions so masterful they could deceive even experienced collectors. Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she considered the implications. Such skill would have made Mrs. Ashford invaluable to criminal associates, but also dangerous if she had decided to withdraw from their enterprise. By afternoon, Inspector Slack had returned from London with a small leather valise and an expression of grim satisfaction. The contents of locker 34B proved as revealing as they were disturbing. Wrapped carefully in tissue paper were 3 antique lace pieces of extraordinary workmanship, each bearing museum accession numbers that had been lightly erased but remained legible to careful examination. A detailed notebook contained entries that matched the coded list found in Mrs. Ashford's cottage, with initials corresponding to dates and substantial sums of money. Most troubling was a glass vial with its label carefully removed, accompanied by a second sharpened bobbin bearing faint stains that Dr. Haydock examined with obvious concern. The sweet, floral scent that emanated from the implement suggested something far more sinister than the tools of honest craftsmanship. Eleanor Vance, summoned to identify the items, grew increasingly pale as each piece was revealed. When pressed by Inspector Slack about her knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's activities, the young woman's composure finally cracked. "She wasn't just teaching me lace-making," Eleanor whispered. "She was training me to reproduce specific historical pieces. She had photographs, detailed measurements, even samples of original threads. I thought it was for educational purposes, but I began to suspect otherwise." Her confession revealed a sophisticated operation that extended far beyond simple theft. Mrs. Ashford had been creating perfect replicas to replace museum pieces, which were then sold to private collectors who asked no questions about provenance. The visitors who came at night weren't collectors, but couriers, bringing specifications and collecting finished work with businesslike efficiency. Timothy Fairfax, when questioned about his evening visit to Mrs. Ashford's cottage, displayed the nervous bravado of a man with secrets to conceal. His explanation of a final business appeal rang hollow, particularly when Miss Marple quietly mentioned the peacock blue silk thread found caught on the rose thorn beneath Mrs. Ashford's window. His involuntary gesture toward his throat, checking his cravat, did not escape her notice. "The difficulty," Miss Marple observed gently as Inspector Slack prepared to focus his investigation on the obvious suspects, "is that while Mr. Fairfax clearly has something to hide, the pattern of this crime suggests someone with much more intimate knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's methods and materials." Her observation proved prescient when Mrs. Clegg arrived with news that a Mr. Gray had taken rooms at the Crown Inn, a tall gentleman with a scar beneath his left eye, who had been asking pointed questions about Mrs. Ashford's recent activities. The postmistress also revealed that the mysterious visitor had inquired about any parcels or registered letters, displaying the sort of detailed knowledge that suggested more than casual interest. As evening approached, Miss Marple found herself contemplating the various threads of evidence and motive that were beginning to weave themselves into a recognizable pattern. The forgery operation, the insurance investigator closing in, the mysterious Mr. Gray, and the growing desperation of someone close enough to Mrs. Ashford to know exactly how to turn her own tools against her. The peacock blue silk thread seemed to shimmer with new significance as she considered which of the village residents possessed both the knowledge and the desperation necessary for such an intimate betrayal. The web that had seemed to stretch to London was contracting again, drawn tight around Little Wickham itself, where someone had transformed the delicate art of lace-making into an instrument of murder. In Miss Marple's long experience, the most shocking crimes often grew from the most ordinary circumstances, and she suspected that the final revelation would prove as intricate and carefully planned as the finest examples of Mrs. Ashford's deadly craft. The morning brought Inspector Slack to the Crown Inn with renewed purpose, his overnight contemplation of the evidence having crystallized around the mysterious Mr. Gray. Miss Marple, accompanied by Mrs. Bantry, on what appeared to be a casual morning constitutional, positioned herself in the inn's small parlor, where the better light for her knitting provided an excellent vantage point for observing the proceedings. Mr. Gray proved to be a man of perhaps 50 years, impeccably dressed despite the early hour, who received Inspector Slack's summons with the calm composure of someone accustomed to official inquiries. His credentials, when produced, identified him as Mr. Alistair Gray, senior investigator for Hartwell and Associates, a London firm specializing in art theft and insurance fraud for Lloyd's of London. Mrs. Ashford was under surveillance, Mr. Gray explained with professional directness, as the suspected mastermind of an international forgery ring targeting antique textiles. Our investigation has traced thefts from museums and private collections across England and the continent, with losses exceeding £200,000. He produced a leather portfolio containing photographs that matched several pieces Miss Marple had observed in Mrs. Ashford's workshop, each bearing museum accession numbers and detailed provenance records. The scope of the operation proved far more sophisticated than anyone in Little Wickham had imagined. Mrs. Ashford had not simply been creating replicas, but orchestrating a complex scheme whereby perfect forgeries were substituted for museum pieces, which were then sold to private collectors who asked no questions about authenticity. Recent laboratory analysis had revealed that several supposedly antique pieces contained modern synthetic threads, a discovery that threatened to expose the entire network. Dr. Haydick's analysis of the poisoned bobbin provided the crucial forensic breakthrough. The toxin, he determined, was a concentrated derivative of Atropa belladonna, commonly known as deadly nightshade, prepared with a masking agent that accounted for the sweet floral scent. Administered through a puncture wound, he explained, it would cause rapid paralysis of the respiratory system, leading to death within minutes. The precision required suggests someone with considerable knowledge of both the poison's properties and Mrs. Ashford's working methods. Inspector Slack's systematic questioning of the village residents revealed layers of motive and opportunity that complicated rather than clarified the case. Timothy Fairfax, when pressed about his evening visit to Mrs. Ashford's cottage, finally admitted that his business proposition had been more threat than offer. Financial difficulties had led him to attempt blackmail, having discovered evidence of the forgery operation during his inquiries about her patterns. She laughed at me, he confessed, his usual bravado deflated. Said I was a small-town amateur trying to play with professionals. Eleanor Vance's testimony proved most illuminating when she revealed details about Mrs. Ashford's mysterious visitors. There was one woman in particular, she whispered, her fear palpable. Mrs. Ashford called her the collector. She came several times, always at night, and was very demanding about specific pieces. She had a way of looking at Mrs. Ashford that made me shiver. Miss Marple observed these revelations with quiet attention while her knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm. She particularly noted Mrs. Whitmore's reactions during the questioning, how the vicar's wife grew increasingly pale as the scope of Mrs. Ashford's activities became clear, and how her hands trembled slightly when arranging the tea service. The investigation took a more personal turn when Miss Marple mentioned, with characteristic gentleness, that she had noticed Mrs. Whitmore's volunteer work with the church's historical artifacts would have provided extensive knowledge of preservation techniques. The comment seemed innocuous enough, but Mrs. Whitmore's sharp intake of breath suggested it had struck closer to home than intended. Dr. Haydock's additional research into the poison revealed a crucial detail that connected all the threads. Belladonna derivatives were once commonly used in certain museum preservation processes, he explained, before safer alternatives were developed. Someone with access to old conservation materials might well have encountered such substances. The pattern was becoming clearer to Miss Marple as she worked through the implications of each revelation. Mrs. Ashford's operation would have required someone with local knowledge and social respectability to provide cover for her activities. Mrs. Whitmore's position in village society, her access to historical materials through her volunteer work, and her intimate knowledge of preservation techniques would have made her an invaluable confederate. When Inspector Slack discovered a small cake of beeswax in the church vestry with a neat hollow pressed into its surface, as though to mold or cap something slender, the evidence began to form a recognizable pattern. Mrs. Whitmore's frequent visits to Mrs. Ashford's cottage, ostensibly bringing small comforts, would have provided ample opportunity to observe the lacemaker's tools and routines. The peacock blue silk thread found on the rose thorn beneath Mrs. Ashford's window took on new significance when Miss Marple recalled seeing similar material in the vicarage during various committee meetings. The thread's presence suggested someone had been at the cottage window, perhaps observing or preparing for what was to come. As evening approached, Miss Marple found a square envelope slipped under her cottage door. The handwriting was cramped and unfamiliar. "Do not let the girl talk. She will follow." There was no signature, but the crude threat spoke of someone growing desperate as the investigation drew closer to the truth. The web of evidence was contracting around Little Wickham itself, drawn tight by someone who had transformed the delicate art of lace-making into an instrument of murder. Miss Marple suspected that the final revelation would prove as intricate and carefully planned as the finest examples of Mrs. Ashford's deadly craft, with each thread crossing its neighbor at precisely the right moment to create a pattern of guilt that could no longer be concealed. The gentle vicar's wife, with her charitable visits and helpful nature, had positioned herself perfectly to observe, to learn, and ultimately to act when the pressures of exposure became too great to bear. In Miss Marple's long experience, the most shocking crimes often grew from the most ordinary circumstances, and she anticipated that Mrs. Whitmore's facade of village respectability would soon crumble under the weight of carefully accumulated evidence. The anonymous threat slipped beneath Miss Marple's door proved to be both warning and revelation. She examined the crude paper with the careful attention she might give to a particularly intricate knitting pattern, noting how the disguised handwriting bore subtle characteristics of education attempting to mask itself as desperation. The quality of the stationery itself spoke of someone with access to the vicarage's correspondence supplies, while the urgent tone suggested a person unaccustomed to direct criminal action. Mrs. Bantry arrived for their customary morning tea to find Miss Marple in a state of quiet contemplation that her oldest friend recognized as the prelude to understanding. "You've seen something the rest of us have missed, haven't you, Jane?" she observed, settling herself where the morning light illuminated both their needlework and their conversation. Miss Marple's response carried the gentle indirection that often preceded her most significant insights. "I've been thinking about patterns, Dolly. How they repeat themselves across different mediums, and how sometimes the most obvious design is the one we fail to see because we're examining individual threads too closely." She held up her current work, noting how a single dropped stitch could unravel an entire section if not caught in time. The morning brought Eleanor Vance to the cottage in a state of barely controlled panic, clutching her own threatening message with trembling fingers. Her expanded testimony revealed details that cast the entire investigation in a different light, particularly her description of village residents who had visited Mrs. Ashford during regular social hours, moving through the cottage with the familiarity of established partners rather than casual acquaintances. "There was one lady who seemed to know exactly where everything was kept," Eleanor whispered, accepting the offered cup of tea with obvious relief. She would go directly to specific drawers and examine the lace pieces with considerable expertise. Mrs. Ashford called her "my dear partner," and they would discuss business matters in voices that suggested long-standing collaboration. Inspector Slack's systematic review of this new information, cross-referenced with the evidence from London, revealed disturbing correlations between certain social visits and the disappearance of specific pieces from Mrs. Ashford's workshop. Mr. Gray's additional inquiries had uncovered several private collectors who had purchased what they believed to be authentic antique pieces through intermediaries possessing impeccable credentials and scholarly authority. The investigation took a decisive turn when Dr. Haydock's analysis of the church vestry's preservation materials revealed traces of the same belladonna derivative found on the poisoned bobbin. Access to these historical chemicals was restricted to a small group of volunteers, with Mrs. Whitmore's name appearing prominently on logs corresponding to dates when museum thefts had occurred in neighboring counties. Miss Marple's suggestion of an informal tea gathering at her cottage provided the perfect opportunity to observe behavioral patterns under controlled circumstances. Mrs. Whitmore accepted the invitation with characteristic graciousness, insisting on contributing her own refreshments with the thoughtful attention that had made her indispensable to every village committee. The afternoon gathering assembled in Miss Marple's parlor, where the scent of lavender and beeswax polish created an atmosphere of domestic tranquility. She poured with practiced hands while maintaining gentle conversation about gardens and parish duties, all the while observing how Mrs. Whitmore's usually composed demeanor showed subtle signs of strain. The vicar's wife's smile held just a fraction too long, and her gaze moved with nervous precision from Eleanor's face to the tea service and back again. Eleanor remained taut with apprehension, while Timothy Fairfax attempted his usual charm, but achieved only fidgeting discomfort. Miss Marple noted with interest how Mrs. Whitmore handled the delicate china, with movements remarkably similar to those she had observed in Mrs. Ashford's workshop, suggesting familiarity with precision work that extended beyond simple household management. The crucial moment came when Miss Marple detected a faint, almost perfumed sweetness rising with the steam as Mrs. Whitmore lifted the silver strainer. With characteristic presence of mind, she contrived a small accident with the milk jug, creating sufficient distraction to exchange the strainer for another while setting the original aside on a saucer behind the tea caddy. When service resumed, the suspicious scent had vanished, but Mrs. Whitmore's hand had tightened momentarily on her jelly jar in a gesture that suggested recognition of the substitution. Dr. Haydock's later examination of the set-aside strainer confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions, revealing residue that produced telltale physiological responses in laboratory testing. The discovery represented a desperate attempt to silence Eleanor before her testimony could complete the case, using the same method that had proven successful with Mrs. Ashford. Inspector Slack's subsequent search of the church vestry uncovered additional evidence that connected Mrs. Whitmore definitively to the crime. The beeswax cake showed fresh cuts where material had been removed, while a cork bore, sticky with faint perfume, provided the tool for creating the hollow pellets used to deliver the poison. Most damning was the discovery of a hidden compartment containing detailed photographs of museum pieces, precise measurements, and correspondence files, revealing Mrs. Whitmore's role as primary contact between Mrs. Ashford and London buyers. The letters, written in Mrs. Whitmore's careful hand, demonstrated sophisticated understanding of art markets and authentication processes. Her position as the vicar's wife had provided perfect cover for travel and meetings with collectors, while her volunteer work with historical preservation gave her the expertise necessary to identify valuable pieces and plan their acquisition. Eleanor's final revelation about the argument she had overheard between Mrs. Ashford and her partner illuminated the pressures that had led to murder. Mrs. Ashford had wanted to end the operation as Mr. Gray's investigation drew closer, but her partner insisted they had commitments that couldn't be broken without serious consequences. The financial motivations became clear when Inspector Slack examined the vicarage's accounts, revealing the constant struggle to maintain the building and fund Mrs. Whitmore's charitable activities on their modest income. As evening approached, Miss Marple prepared for what she anticipated would be the final confrontation. The pattern was nearly complete, each thread crossing its neighbor at precisely the right moment to create a design of guilt that could no longer be concealed. Mrs. Whitmore's transformation from respected community pillar to desperate criminal represented the sort of moral deterioration that Miss Marple had observed too often in her long experience with human nature. The threatening notes, the poisoned tea strainer, and the elaborate forgery operation all pointed to someone who had begun with small compromises and found herself trapped in an increasingly dangerous web of deception. The delicate art of lace-making had indeed been transformed into an instrument of murder, wielded by hands that had once sought only to preserve and protect the village she claimed to serve. The weight of accumulated evidence had transformed the quiet investigation into something approaching inevitability, yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by the delicate balance between justice and compassion that such revelations always demanded. She had observed too many lives unravel under the pressure of hidden guilt to take satisfaction in the approaching resolution, though she recognized the necessity of allowing truth to emerge in its proper time and manner. Inspector Slack's arrangements for Eleanor Vance's protection proved both wise and illuminating. The young woman had been moved to Dr. Haydock's surgery for the night, ostensibly for medical observation, but actually to prevent any further attempts on her life. Her gratitude was mixed with a growing understanding of how close she had come to sharing Mrs. Ashford's fate, and her expanded testimony revealed details that cast the entire operation in sharper focus. The morning brought Mrs. Bantry to Miss Marple's cottage with news that proved most significant. Mrs. Whitmore had spent the early hours at the church ostensibly preparing for the morning service, but actually, Mrs. Bantry suspected, attempting to remove any remaining evidence from the vestry. "She seemed quite agitated, Jane," Mrs. Bantry observed, settling herself with her customary cup of tea. Not at all her usual composed self. And there was something almost frantic about the way she was rearranging things, as though she were looking for something specific. Miss Marple's suggestion of an informal evening gathering at her cottage provided the perfect opportunity to observe Mrs. Whitmore's behavior under controlled circumstances. The invitation, couched in terms of discussing parish matters and sharing comfort during these difficult times, was accepted with the gracious efficiency that had always characterized the vicar's wife's social interactions. However, Miss Marple noted a subtle change in Mrs. Whitmore's usual warmth, a careful calculation that suggested someone weighing each word before speaking. Inspector Slack's discreet positioning in the adjacent room allowed him to observe the proceedings while maintaining the informal atmosphere that Miss Marple knew would be essential for encouraging unguarded responses. Dr. Haydock's presence, ostensibly to check on Miss Marple's health after the recent shocks, provided additional witness to whatever revelations might emerge from the evening's conversation. Mrs. Whitmore arrived precisely at the appointed time, carrying a small basket of preserves with the thoughtful attention to social niceties that had made her indispensable to every village committee. Her appearance was impeccable, as always, though Miss Marple observed how her usually steady hands showed the slightest tremor as she arranged her skirts and accepted the offered refreshments. The conversation began with the gentle inquiries about parish activities that formed the comfortable foundation of village social interaction. Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their steady rhythm as she guided the discussion toward the recent tragic events, noting how Mrs. Whitmore's responses became increasingly careful and measured as the topics grew more sensitive. "Such a shock about Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple observed with characteristic mildness. "One never knows what complexities lie beneath the surface of even the most ordinary lives. I've been thinking about her remarkable skill with those antique patterns. Such expertise usually takes decades to develop, yet she seemed to have mastered techniques that most contemporary craftspeople find quite impossible to replicate." Mrs. Whitmore's teacup paused halfway to her lips, and Miss Marple detected the briefest flash of something approaching panic before the familiar composed mask reasserted itself. "Mrs. Ashford was indeed talented," she replied carefully, "though I confess I knew very little about the technical aspects of her work." Miss Marple's gentle probing continued with observations about the preservation work in the church vestry, the historical materials that required such careful handling, and the expertise necessary to distinguish authentic pieces from even the most skillful reproductions. Each topic was approached with the innocent curiosity of an elderly lady seeking to understand complex matters. Yet Mrs. Whitmore's growing tension suggested she recognized the careful pattern of inquiry. Dr. Haydock's contribution to the conversation proved particularly effective when he mentioned his analysis of the various chemicals found in the vestry. "Fascinating how some of those old preservation compounds contained substances we now know to be quite dangerous," he remarked. "Belladonna derivatives, for instance, were once commonly used before we understood their toxic properties. Someone with access to those materials would need considerable knowledge to handle them safely." The mention of belladonna produced a visible reaction from Mrs. Whitmore, her carefully controlled composure cracking just enough to reveal the strain she had been concealing. Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat, and Miss Marple observed how her gaze flickered toward the door as though calculating the possibility of escape. The crucial moment came when Miss Marple mentioned, with apparent casualness, that she had been examining some of the lace pieces in the church collection and had noticed remarkable similarities to items she had seen in museum exhibitions. "Such extraordinary craftsmanship," she mused. "Almost too perfect, one might say. The sort of work that suggests access to original pieces for detailed study and measurement." Mrs. Whitmore's response revealed the desperate calculation of someone whose carefully constructed deception was crumbling under gentle but relentless pressure. "I'm sure I wouldn't know about such technical matters," she said, her voice carrying a brittleness that had not been present earlier. "My role has always been purely administrative." Yet as she spoke, her eyes moved involuntarily toward Miss Marple's own collection of antique textiles displayed on the mantelpiece, and her expression betrayed the sort of expert assessment that contradicted her claims of ignorance. Miss Marple had observed similar reactions in art dealers and museum curators, the automatic evaluation that comes from years of professional expertise. Inspector Slack's entrance at that moment, ostensibly to check on the evening's proceedings, provided the additional pressure that completed Mrs. Whitmore's psychological collapse. Her facade of innocent cooperation gave way to the desperate defiance of someone whose guilt could no longer be concealed, though she maintained her dignity with the bearing of someone accustomed to bearing responsibility for others. The pattern was finally becoming clear to all present, each thread of evidence crossing its neighbor at precisely the right moment to create a design of guilt that could no longer be denied. Mrs. Whitmore's expertise, her access to materials and methods, her intimate knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's routines, and her desperate need to protect her position in village society had combined to transform the delicate art of lace-making into an instrument of murder. As the evening drew toward its inevitable conclusion, Miss Marple prepared for the final revelation that would complete the pattern she had been so carefully constructing. The gentle vicar's wife, with her charitable works and helpful nature, had indeed positioned herself perfectly to observe, to learn, and ultimately to act when the pressures of exposure became too great to bear. The silence that followed Inspector Slack's entrance stretched with the peculiar tension that accompanies moments when pretense begins to crumble under careful scrutiny. Mrs. Whitmore sat with her teacup balanced precariously on her knee, her knuckles showing white against the delicate china, while her eyes moved between the faces surrounding her with the calculating assessment of someone seeking an escape route that no longer existed. Miss Marple's knitting needles continued their gentle rhythm, though her mild blue eyes had taken on the focused attention of someone approaching the culmination of a long and careful investigation. Years of experience with human nature had taught her to recognize the precise moment when guilt could no longer bear the weight of concealment, and she sensed that Mrs. Whitmore was approaching that critical threshold. "I've been thinking about patterns this evening," Miss Marple began with characteristic gentleness, her voice carrying the conversational tone that often preceded her most significant observations. How they repeat themselves across different circumstances, and how sometimes the most obvious design is the one we fail to see because we're examining individual threads too closely. She paused to examine her own needlework, noting how a single dropped stitch could unravel an entire section if not caught in time. Take, for instance, the remarkable skill required for preservation work. The sort of expertise that allows someone to handle delicate historical materials, to understand their composition and vulnerabilities, to know precisely which substances might protect or, conversely, which might prove harmful if misused. Mrs. Whitmore's teacup rattled almost imperceptibly against its saucer, a sound so slight that only the most attentive observer might have noticed. Miss Marple, however, had built her reputation on noticing precisely such details. "The church vestry contains such fascinating materials," Miss Marple continued, her tone remaining conversational despite the growing tension in the room. "Dr. Haydock was telling me about some of the old preservation compounds, how they contained substances we now know to be quite dangerous. Belladonna derivatives, for instance, once commonly used before safer alternatives were developed. Someone with access to those materials would need considerable knowledge to handle them properly." The mention of belladonna produced a visible reaction from Mrs. Whitmore, her carefully controlled composure cracking just enough to reveal the strain she had been concealing. Her hand moved unconsciously to her throat, and Miss Marple observed how her gaze flickered toward the door as though calculating possibilities that had long since vanished. Inspector Slack maintained his position by the doorway, his presence serving as both witness and silent reminder that the evening's social gathering had transformed into something far more serious. Dr. Haydock, recognizing the delicate nature of the psychological pressure being applied, remained quietly observant, his medical training allowing him to note the subtle signs of mounting stress in Mrs. Whitmore's demeanor. "There's something particularly tragic," Miss Marple observed, her needles pausing as she looked directly at Mrs. Whitmore. about seeing someone's greatest talents turned to destructive purposes, the very skills that might have brought recognition and respect in legitimate endeavors, corrupted by circumstances or pressures that seemed insurmountable at the time. Mrs. Whitmore's breathing had become noticeably shallow, and a faint flush was beginning to spread across her neck. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a brittleness that had not been present earlier in the evening. "I'm sure I don't understand what you're suggesting, Miss Marple," she said, though her words lacked conviction. "My work with the Church Preservation Committee has always been purely administrative." Yet as she spoke, her eyes moved involuntarily toward Miss Marple's collection of antique textiles displayed on the mantelpiece, and her expression betrayed the sort of expert assessment that contradicted her claims of ignorance. Miss Marple had observed similar reactions in art dealers and museum curators, the automatic evaluation that comes from years of professional expertise. The crucial moment came when Miss Marple rose gracefully from her chair and moved toward the tea service, her movements deliberate and unhurried. "I do hope you found the refreshments satisfactory this evening," she said, her hand hovering near the small silver strainer that she had discreetly set aside earlier. "I noticed you seemed particularly interested in the tea preparation. Such attention to detail is admirable in someone who appreciates the finer aspects of domestic arrangements." Mrs. Whitmore's eyes fixed on the strainer with an intensity that spoke volumes, her face draining of color as she recognized the implications of its placement. The involuntary reaction lasted only seconds, but it was enough to confirm Miss Marple's carefully constructed theory about the afternoon's attempted poisoning. "You see," Miss Marple continued gently, "I've learned that people's habits often reveal more truth than their words. The way someone handles delicate materials, their familiarity with preservation techniques, their knowledge of which substances might be harmful when combined with others. These small details create patterns that, once recognized, become quite unmistakable." The psychological pressure had reached its breaking point. Mrs. Whitmore's carefully maintained facade was crumbling under the weight of accumulated evidence and Miss Marple's relentless but gentle probing. Her hands trembled as she set down her teacup, and when she looked up, her eyes held the desperate calculation of someone whose options had been systematically eliminated. Inspector Slack stepped forward from his position by the doorway, his notebook appearing in his hands with practiced efficiency. The informal atmosphere of the evening gathering had transformed into the opening stages of a formal confession, though Miss Marple suspected that the full revelation of Mrs. Whitmore's crimes would require careful handling to ensure complete disclosure. The pattern was finally becoming clear to all present, each thread of evidence crossing its neighbor at precisely the right moment to create a design of guilt that could no longer be concealed. Mrs. Whitmore's expertise, her access to materials and methods, her intimate knowledge of village routines, and her desperate need to protect her position in society had combined to transform the delicate art of lace-making into an instrument of murder. As the evening drew toward its inevitable conclusion, Miss Marple prepared for the final revelation that would complete the intricate pattern she had been so carefully constructing. The gentle vicar's wife, with her charitable works and helpful nature, had indeed positioned herself perfectly to observe, to learn, and ultimately to act when the pressures of exposure became too great to bear. The truth, like the finest examples of Mrs. Ashford's lace work, was emerging through patient observation and careful deduction, each small detail finding its proper place in the larger design of crime and consequence that had been hidden beneath the peaceful surface of Little Wycombe's daily life. The silence that had settled over Miss Marple's parlor carried the weight of unspoken truths, each tick of the mantel clock marking another moment in which Mrs. Whitmore's carefully constructed facade grew more difficult to maintain. Her hands, those remarkably steady hands that had guided countless church committees and charitable endeavors, now trembled slightly as she reached for her teacup, only to set it down again without drinking. Miss Marple rose from her chair with characteristic grace, moving toward a small side table where she had earlier placed several items from her own collection of antique textiles. Among them was a delicate lace collar that Mr. Gray had brought from the recovered evidence, its intricate patterns catching the lamplight with ethereal beauty. "Such exquisite work," Miss Marple observed, lifting the piece with reverent care. "I confess I've never been entirely certain about the technical distinctions between different lace types. This appears to be Mechlin, doesn't it? The way the threads create such delicate motifs." The correction escaped Mrs. Whitmore before she could prevent it, her professional expertise overriding her caution. "Not Mechlin," she said sharply, then caught herself as the implications became clear. "That is, I believe it's Valenciennes. The continuous ground is quite distinctive, whereas Mechlin would have a gimp outlining the pattern work." The words hung in the air like threads waiting to be woven into a larger pattern. Miss Marple's mild blue eyes reflected gentle appreciation rather than triumph. "How knowledgeable you are, my dear. Such technical expertise usually requires years of study and practical experience." Mrs. Whitmore's face had grown pale, her breathing shallow as she realized how completely her supposed ignorance had been exposed. Inspector Slack remained motionless by the doorway, understanding instinctively that this moment required delicate handling rather than official intervention. "You see," Miss Marple continued softly, returning to her chair and resuming her knitting with steady hands, "I've been thinking about the particular skills required for Mrs. Ashford's enterprise. Creating forgeries convincing enough to fool museum experts would demand not only exceptional craftsmanship, but also intimate knowledge of historical techniques, preservation methods, and authentication processes." She paused to examine her needlework, noting how each stitch built upon the previous one to create the larger design. "Someone with your background in church preservation work would possess exactly such expertise. Your volunteer efforts with historical textiles, your access to old conservation materials, your reputation for scholarly accuracy, all would have made you invaluable to such an operation." Mrs. Whitmore's composure was crumbling visibly, her usual social confidence replaced by the desperate calculation of someone whose options were rapidly disappearing. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a brittleness that had not been present earlier. "I don't understand what you're suggesting," she whispered, though her words lacked conviction. "My work has always been entirely legitimate." Miss Marple produced the peacock blue silk thread from her knitting basket, holding it where the lamplight revealed its lustrous quality. "This was found caught on the rose thorn beneath Mrs. Ashford's cottage window. Such distinctive silk, the sort one might find in a vicarage where quality materials are appreciated for their durability and beauty." The physical evidence seemed to complete Mrs. Whitmore's psychological collapse. Her hands moved unconsciously to her throat, and Miss Marple observed how her gaze flickered between the thread and the door as though seeking an escape route that no longer existed. "The financial pressures must have been overwhelming," Miss Marple observed with genuine compassion. "Maintaining the vicarage, funding charitable works, meeting the expectations of an entire community, all on a modest stipend that never seemed quite adequate for the responsibilities involved." Mrs. Whitmore's response came in fragments, her carefully maintained facade giving way to the desperate honesty of someone whose burden had become too heavy to bear alone. "You don't understand the constant struggle," she said, her voice barely audible. "The roof repairs, the organ maintenance, the Mothers' League, the youth, programs. Everyone expected miracles with resources that simply didn't exist." Her partial confession revealed the gradual nature of her involvement with Mrs. Ashford's operation. What had begun as legitimate consultation about textile preservation had evolved into something far more complex as financial pressures mounted and opportunities presented themselves. Mrs. Whitmore's expertise and social position had provided perfect cover for activities that reached far beyond Little Wycombe's boundaries. "She promised it would end," Mrs. Whitmore continued, her voice gaining strength as the burden of secrecy began to lift. "After this final arrangement, we would stop completely. But when Mr. Gray's investigation grew closer, when she wanted to destroy everything and disappear, I couldn't simply abandon what I had worked so hard to build here. The technical details of the murder emerged gradually through Miss Marple's gentle questioning. Mrs. Whitmore's knowledge of Mrs. Ashford's working methods, combined with her access to the belladonna derivatives in the church vestry, had provided both opportunity and means. The modified bobbin had been prepared with scientific precision, its effectiveness dependent upon intimate familiarity with the victim's routines and tools. Inspector Slack stepped forward as Mrs. Whitmore's confession reached its natural conclusion, his notebook appearing with practiced efficiency. The informal atmosphere of the evening gathering had transformed into the preliminary stages of formal proceedings, though the full scope of the criminal enterprise would require additional investigation. Dr. Haydock approached Mrs. Whitmore with professional concern, recognizing the signs of someone whose psychological reserves had been completely exhausted. "Perhaps we should proceed gradually," he suggested quietly. "There will be time for complete statements once proper arrangements have been made." As Mrs. Whitmore was assisted from the cottage, her dignity remained intact despite her circumstances. She walked with the bearing of someone accustomed to responsibility and leadership, though her carefully constructed world had crumbled around her. The peaceful village evenings seemed to absorb this disruption with the same quiet efficiency that marked all of Little Wickham's social adjustments. Miss Marple remained in her chair as the cottage returned to its customary quiet, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm while her mind worked through the remaining complexities of the case. The pattern was nearly complete, each thread of evidence having found its proper place in the larger design of crime and consequence that had been hidden beneath the village's peaceful surface. The delicate art of lace-making had indeed been transformed into an instrument of murder, wielded by hands that had once sought only to preserve and protect the community she claimed to serve. Yet Miss Marple suspected that several threads remained to be woven into the final pattern before the complete truth could be revealed, and Little Wickham could begin the process of healing from this betrayal of trust. The morning after Mrs. Whitmore's departure brought a peculiar stillness to Little Wickham, as though the village itself required time to absorb the shocking revelations that had shattered its peaceful facade. Miss Marple rose early, her sleep having been punctuated by thoughts of the intricate pattern of deception that had finally revealed itself in all its tragic complexity. Inspector Slack arrived with the dawn, his notebook filled with preliminary observations that would require careful expansion in the formal statements to come. Dr. Haydock accompanied him, his medical training making him sensitive to the psychological complexities that such revelations always created within small communities. Mrs. Bantry, who had witnessed the previous evening's unraveling, sat with a stunned expression that reflected the broader village sentiment. "Such a tragedy," Mrs. Bantry murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. "To think that Mrs. Whitmore, of all people, could be capable of such calculated deception. The vicar's wife, the woman we all trusted implicitly with our most precious community endeavors." Miss Marple's knitting needles maintained their gentle rhythm as she considered the full scope of what had been revealed. "The most disturbing aspect, I believe, is not the simple fact of criminality, but rather how gradually one compromise led to another until she found herself trapped in circumstances she could no longer control through legitimate means." Inspector Slack's systematic review of the evidence had revealed the sophisticated nature of Mrs. Whitmore's criminal enterprise. Her confession, when complete, demonstrated methodical planning that extended far beyond a simple moment of desperation. The forgery operation had connections reaching across England and the continent, with Mrs. Ashford serving as the technical center of a network that had operated successfully for nearly 3 years. "The financial records we discovered in Mrs. Whitmore's personal effects," Inspector Slack explained, consulting his notes, "show payments that allowed her to maintain the vicarage and fund her charitable activities without arousing suspicion about their source. The new church roof, the improved parish hall, the scholarship fund for village children, All were funded, at least partially, through criminal proceeds. Miss Marple paused in her knitting to examine the peacock blue silk thread that had provided one of the crucial pieces of evidence. The pattern became clear once I understood that we were dealing not with a crime of passion, but with the systematic elimination of a liability. Mrs. Ashford's growing nervousness about Mr. Gray's investigation threatened to expose the entire network, while her death would provide time to destroy evidence and establish alternative explanations. Dr. Haydock's analysis of the modified bobbin had provided the technical breakthrough that confirmed the murder method. The precision required to deliver a fatal dose through such a small puncture wound suggests someone with considerable knowledge of both anatomy and toxicology, he observed. Mrs. Whitmore's preservation work would have provided extensive knowledge of chemical interactions, while her volunteer activities at the hospital during the war years would have given her familiarity with medical procedures. The scope of the deception became clearer as the investigation revealed Mrs. Whitmore's role as the primary contact with London buyers. Her reputation as the vicar's wife had provided perfect credentials for handling valuable historical pieces, while her scholarly articles about textile preservation, published in several academic journals, had established her as a recognized authority whose authentication carried considerable weight in collector circles. Eleanor Vance's expanded testimony provided crucial details about how the operation had exploited her genuine skill with lace making. "They spoke about me as though I were another tool in their workshop," she confided to Miss Marple during a quiet morning visit. Mrs. Whitmore was particularly interested in my progress with the more complex patterns, always asking questions about techniques and timing that seemed oddly specific for casual conversation. Miss Marple's explanation of her deductive process revealed the careful observation of human behavior that had made the solution possible. It began with noticing inconsistencies in Mrs. Whitmore's claimed ignorance about lace-making techniques. Her correction of my deliberate misidentification of the Valenciennes piece revealed expertise that contradicted her assertions of purely administrative involvement. The physical evidence had provided confirmation of what behavioral observation had suggested. The peacock blue silk thread caught on the rose thorn, the hollow in the beeswax cake where poison pellets had been molded, the belladonna derivatives in the church vestry, all pointed to someone with intimate knowledge of both Mrs. Ashford's routines and the materials necessary for creating an untraceable murder weapon. "The attempted poisoning at my tea gathering," Miss Marple continued, "represented a desperate effort to silence Eleanor before her testimony could complete the pattern of guilt. The method was identical. Belladonna derivative delivered through a modified implement, this time the tea strainer rather than a lace bobbin. Timothy Fairfax's role in the affair proved more complex than his initial blackmail attempt had suggested. His frequent business trips to London had provided ideal cover for transporting items between Little Wickham and the network's buyers, though his growing nervousness about the operation had made him increasingly unreliable and ultimately led to his attempt at extortion. As the formal proceedings concluded, Miss Marple found herself reflecting on the patterns of human behavior that had made such crimes possible. The gradual corruption of legitimate expertise, the exploitation of social trust, and the way financial pressures could transform respected community leaders into desperate criminals, all represented variations on themes she had observed throughout her long experience with the darker aspects of human nature. Mrs. Whitmore genuinely believed she was serving the community's best interests, Miss Marple observed to Mrs. Bantry as they walked through the village in the late afternoon. The tragedy lies not in simple wickedness, but in how circumstances and pressures can lead even the most well-intentioned people to justify increasingly questionable actions until they find themselves beyond the reach of redemption. The peaceful village of Little Wickham would recover from this betrayal of trust, as communities always did, though the process would require time and careful attention to healing the wounds that such revelations inevitably created. The church bells, subdued in their evening call to vespers, seemed to acknowledge the community's need for both justice and forgiveness as it began the difficult process of rebuilding trust. Miss Marple returned to her cottage as the sun set behind the ancient elm trees, her knitting basket containing the final threads of evidence that had woven themselves into a pattern of guilt and redemption. The delicate art of lace-making would continue, practiced by honest craftspeople who understood that true skill required not only technical expertise, but also integrity and respect for the traditions they sought to preserve. In her long experience with human nature, Miss Marple had learned that the most shocking crimes often grew from the most ordinary circumstances, and she suspected that the lessons learned from Mrs. Whitmore's downfall would serve Little Wickham well in the years to come. The village would remember that even the most trusted leaders remained vulnerable to the temptations that could transform virtue into vice, and that vigilance in maintaining moral standards was as important as preserving the physical beauty of their ancient community. As darkness settled over the village, Miss Marple settled into her chair by the window, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm while her mind worked through the final complexities of human behavior that had been revealed through this tragic affair. The pattern was complete now, each thread having found its proper place in the larger design of crime and consequence, justice and mercy that would forever mark Little Wickham's understanding of the delicate balance between trust and vigilance that makes community life possible. The days following Mrs. Whitmore's confession brought a peculiar quietude to Little Wickham, as though the village itself required time to absorb the profound betrayal that had shattered its peaceful facade. Miss Marple observed these changes with the same careful attention she had given to the investigation itself, noting how people moved through their daily routines with a subdued awareness that their most trusted community leader had harbored such devastating secrets. The formal resolution, Inspector Slack's systematic completion of the case, revealed the full scope of the international forgery network that had operated from their quiet village. Mr. Gray's investigation had uncovered connections reaching across England and the continent, with losses totaling nearly £400,000 when all the stolen pieces were properly valued. Museums and private collectors began the complex process of recovering their authentic pieces, while determining which items in their collections were actually Mrs. Ashford's sophisticated forgeries. The technical evidence proved overwhelming in its precision. Dr. Haydock's analysis of the modified bobbin demonstrated how Mrs. Whitmore's knowledge of preservation chemicals and anatomical precision had combined to create what might have been the perfect crime. The belladonna derivative, extracted from materials in the church vestry, had been prepared with scientific accuracy that spoke of someone well versed in both chemistry and human physiology. The method was almost elegant in its simplicity, Dr. Haydock explained to Miss Marple as they reviewed the final forensic reports. A single puncture wound, barely visible, delivering a precise dose calculated to cause rapid respiratory paralysis. Without your observation of the behavioral patterns and physical evidence, this might well have been dismissed as natural causes. Individual reckonings. Eleanor Vance faced the future with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. The cottage on Mill Lane, once the center of criminal enterprise, was transformed under her honest stewardship into a legitimate workshop where traditional lace-making techniques could be preserved without the taint of deception. Miss Marple visited regularly, offering encouragement and wisdom gleaned from long observation of human resilience. "Your skill is genuine, my dear," Miss Marple assured her during one of their afternoon conversations. Mrs. Ashford's technical expertise was remarkable, but it was corrupted by the purposes to which it was put. You have the opportunity to honor the craft itself, creating beauty without deception. Timothy Fairfax accepted a position with a London banking firm, his departure from Little Wickham providing relief for a community that preferred not to be reminded of his role in the blackmail attempt. His peacock blue cravats disappeared from village social gatherings, replaced by the subdued attire of someone who had learned harsh lessons about the consequences of moral compromise. The vicar, devastated by his wife's actions, requested transfer to another parish where he could begin rebuilding his ministry without the constant reminder of personal betrayal. His departure was handled with the quiet discretion that small communities employ when protecting those who have suffered through no fault of their own. The new vicar arrived with the understanding that healing would require time and careful attention to rebuilding trust. The broader network. Mr. Gray's expanded investigation revealed that Mrs. Whitmore's operation had been more sophisticated than anyone had initially imagined. Her reputation as the vicar's wife had provided perfect credentials for handling valuable historical pieces, while her scholarly articles about textile preservation, published in academic journals, had established her as a recognized authority whose authentication carried considerable weight in collector circles. The financial records discovered in her personal effects showed how criminal proceeds had funded the new church roof, improved parish facilities, and various charitable programs. The tragic irony was not lost on the community that their most cherished improvements had been built on a foundation of theft and deception. Community healing. As autumn settled over Little Wickham, the village began the delicate process of rebuilding social trust. The church vestry was thoroughly reorganized with new security procedures for handling historical preservation materials. The incident prompted broader reviews of security measures at religious and cultural institutions throughout the county. Mrs. Bantry observed to Miss Marple during one of their regular walks that people seemed more careful in their social interactions, less willing to accept appearances at face value. "It's as though we've all learned to look beneath the surface," she remarked. "Perhaps that's not entirely a bad thing, though it does make life less comfortable." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully. Trust, once broken, requires careful rebuilding, but communities possess remarkable resilience when confronted with betrayal. Little Wickham will emerge from this trial with a deeper appreciation for the moral foundations that make peaceful village life possible. Philosophical reflections. The case had provided Miss Marple with sobering insights into how financial pressures and social expectations could transform even the most respected community leaders into desperate criminals. Mrs. Whitmore's gradual corruption, beginning with small compromises and escalating to murder, represented a pattern she had observed too often in her long experience with human nature. The most disturbing aspect, she reflected to Dr. Haydock, was not the simple fact of criminality, but rather how Mrs. Whitmore genuinely believed she was serving the community's best interests. The charitable works, the church improvements, the scholarship funds, all were funded through criminal proceeds, yet her intentions remained focused on community service even as her methods became increasingly corrupt. The delicate art of lace-making continued in Little, Wickham under Eleanor's honest guidance, practiced by craftspeople who understood that true skill required not only technical expertise, but also integrity and respect for the traditions they sought to preserve. The cottage on Mill Lane became a symbol of redemption, where authentic beauty could flourish without the shadow of deception. Final threads. As winter approached, Miss Marple settled into her chair by the cottage window, her knitting needles resuming their gentle rhythm as she worked on a new project. The evening bells of St. Mary's called the community to vespers with their familiar cadence, their sound carrying across the village green where life had resumed its customary patterns of social interaction and mutual support. The pattern was complete now, each thread having found its proper place in the larger design of crime and consequence, justice and mercy that would forever mark Little Wickham's understanding of how human nature could be both corrupted and redeemed through the choices people made in moments of crisis and temptation. The tragedy of Mrs. Whitmore's downfall would be remembered, but it would not define the village's capacity for trust and forgiveness. In Miss Marple's long experience with human behavior, she had learned that the most shocking crimes often grew from the most ordinary circumstances, and that communities possessed remarkable strength when confronted with the need to distinguish between appearance and reality. The lace-maker's secret had been revealed at last, its intricate pattern of guilt and deception finally unraveled through patient observation and careful deduction. As darkness settled over Little Wickham, Miss Marple reflected that while the threads of human nature could be woven into patterns of great beauty or terrible destruction, the choice of which pattern to create remained, ultimately, in each person's hands. The gentle click of her knitting needles continued in the lamplight, creating something beautiful and honest, stitch by careful stitch, as the village settled into the peaceful rhythm of another evening, wiser now about the complexities that could lie hidden beneath even the most tranquil surface. The spring morning brought an unexpected visitor to Miss Marple's cottage. As Mr. Gray appeared at her door with a leather portfolio and an expression of professional frustration that immediately caught her attention. His investigation into the broader forgery network had proceeded successfully, with arrests made across England and the continent. Yet something continued to trouble him about the case's resolution. "Several of the pieces we recovered from Mrs. Ashford's workshop," he explained as Miss Marple poured tea with her customary precision, "have proven to be her own forgeries rather than the stolen originals. The technical quality is extraordinary, but laboratory analysis reveals modern synthetic threads that weren't available when the authentic pieces were created. This suggests that Mrs. Ashford possessed considerably more foresight than we initially credited her with." Miss Marple's knitting needles paused as she considered this revelation. Her mind returned to the cottage on Mill Lane, to roses pruned with mathematical precision and curtains drawn with careful attention to detail. Such methodical habits suggested someone who prepared for contingencies, who understood the value of insurance against betrayal or discovery. "A woman of Mrs. Ashford's careful nature," Miss Marple observed gently, "would not have placed all her security in the hands of partners whose reliability she had reason to question. I suspect she may have taken precautions that we have not yet discovered." Her suggestion prompted a return to the cottage, where Eleanor Vance joined them with the eager cooperation of someone seeking to honor her teacher's memory while distancing herself from criminal associations. The workshop appeared exactly as the police had left it, with lace pillows arranged in careful order and the bobbin cabinet displaying its tragic emptiness where the modified implement had once resided. Miss Marple moved directly to the window where she had previously noticed the disturbed earth beneath the climbing roses. The soil showed signs of recent activity, though whether from legitimate gardening or more secretive purposes remained unclear. Eleanor fetched Mrs. Ashford's gardening tools, and Inspector Slack, summoned by telephone, arrived to oversee the careful excavation that Miss Marple's instincts suggested might prove illuminating. The discovery came within minutes of beginning their search. A biscuit tin, its surface showing the effects of recent burial, but its contents protected by careful wrapping, yielded treasures that transformed their understanding of Mrs. Ashford's final intentions. 2 lace pieces of extraordinary delicacy, their authenticity immediately apparent even to untrained eyes, lay carefully preserved between tissue paper layers. More significant was the letter written in Mrs. Ashford's precise handwriting, addressing no specific recipient, but clearly intended as both confession and redemption. Her words revealed a woman tormented by the corruption of her considerable talents, who had recognized too late the moral precipice toward which her financial desperation had led her. "What has been done cannot be undone," the letter read, "but I can attempt to set right what remains within my power. I have hidden certain authentic pieces with the intention of returning them anonymously to their proper custodians. If this enterprise has taught me anything, it is that true skill lies not in deception, however masterful, but in honest creation that honors the traditions it seeks to preserve." The letter included cryptic references to additional hiding places, breadcrumbs for those with sufficient knowledge to interpret them. Eleanor's expanded recollection of Mrs. Ashford's behavior in her final weeks provided context for these preparations. The lace-maker had grown increasingly withdrawn, spending long hours in contemplation of her work and speaking often about the importance of leaving something worthwhile behind. Dr. Haydick's analysis of the recovered pieces confirmed their authenticity through techniques that Mrs. Ashford's forgeries, however skillful, could not replicate. The discovery provided Mr. Gray with the breakthrough his investigation required, leading to the recovery of additional stolen items and the identification of several previously unknown members of the criminal network. As spring progressed toward summer, Little Wickham settled into patterns of renewed trust and cautious optimism. Eleanor Vance had established herself as the village's legitimate lace-maker, her workshop serving as both testament to honest craftsmanship and symbol of redemption's possibility. Her pieces, while perhaps lacking Mrs. Ashford's technical perfection, possessed an authenticity that spoke to those who understood the difference between skill employed for beauty and skill corrupted by desperation. The new vicar, Reverend Matthews, had arrived with wisdom sufficient to understand that his role involved community healing as much as spiritual guidance. His sermons touched gently on themes of forgiveness and second chances, without dwelling on recent events, allowing the congregation to process their experiences at their own pace. The church vestry had been reorganized with proper security measures, ensuring that historical preservation could continue without providing opportunities for future misuse. Mrs. Bantry observed during one of their regular walks that people seemed more discerning in their social interactions, less willing to accept appearances without deeper consideration. "It's as though we've all learned to look beneath the surface," she remarked. "Perhaps that's not entirely unfortunate, though it does make life less comfortable." Miss Marple nodded thoughtfully as they paused beside the cottage where Eleanor worked at her lace pillow, visible through windows that now framed honest industry rather than criminal enterprise. "Trust, once broken, requires careful rebuilding," she observed, "but communities possess remarkable resilience when confronted with betrayal. Little Wickham will emerge from this trial with deeper appreciation for the moral foundations that make peaceful village life possible." The case had provided sobering insights into how financial pressures and social expectations could transform even respected community leaders into desperate criminals. Mrs. Whitmore's gradual corruption, beginning with small compromises and escalating to murder, represented a pattern Miss Marple had observed too often in her long experience with human nature. Yet Mrs. Ashford's final attempt at redemption suggested that, even in the darkest circumstances, the possibility of moral recovery remained available to those with courage to pursue, and as evening settled over Little Wickham, Miss Marple returned to her cottage where lamplight illuminated the christening shawl taking shape beneath her skilled fingers. Each stitch built upon the previous one to create something beautiful and lasting, much like the gradual process through which communities rebuilt trust after betrayal. The church bells marked the hour with their familiar cadence, calling residents to shared worship and social gathering with the same gentle insistence that had characterized village life for centuries. The sound carried across gardens where roses bloomed without concealing secrets, past windows that framed honest work, through streets where neighbors had learned to balance trust with wisdom. Miss Marple smiled as she worked, recognizing that while human nature remained capable of both great beauty and terrible destruction, the choice of which pattern to create rested ultimately in each person's hands. The delicate art of community life, like the finest examples of traditional lace-making, required patience, skill, and above all, the integrity to ensure that each thread found its proper place in the larger design. The lace-maker's secret had been fully revealed at last, its intricate pattern of guilt and redemption finally understood through patient observation and careful deduction. As darkness settled over the village, the gentle click of knitting needles continued in the lamplight, creating something beautiful and honest, stitch by careful stitch, while Little Wickham settled into the peaceful rhythm of another evening, wiser now about the complexities that could lie hidden beneath even the most tranquil surface, yet still capable of trust, forgiveness, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from work well done. The autumn afternoon found Miss Marple in her familiar chair beneath the elm, her knitting needles moving with practiced rhythm as Inspector Slack completed his final report. The case of Mrs. Cordelia Ashford had reached its natural conclusion, each thread of evidence finally woven into a pattern that revealed the full scope of human frailty and redemption. The method was elegantly simple, Miss Marple observed, her voice carrying the gentle authority that had guided the investigation from its beginning. Mrs. Whitmore prepared her weapon in the church vestry, extracting belladonna from the old preservation compounds and forming it into a tiny pellet with beeswax. The modified bobbin, sharpened and weighted, became the delivery system. At the fete, she needed only a moment during the demonstration, the affectionate touch of a helpful vicar's wife steadying Mrs. Ashford's shoulder, to press the point beneath the ear where the skin is thin and absorption rapid. Inspector Slack nodded, consulting his notes. The attempted poisoning of Miss Vance through the tea strainer confirmed the method. And the peacock blue silk thread? Miss Marple smiled gently. Young Mr. Fairfax's contribution to our confusion, I'm afraid. His midnight reconnaissance at Mrs. Ashford's cottage window cost him a thread from his rather ostentatious cravat, but revealed only his clumsy blackmail attempt, not murder. The broader network had been dismantled through Mr. Gray's systematic investigation, with authentic pieces recovered and returned to their rightful institutions. Mrs. Whitmore faced justice with the composed dignity of someone who had accepted the consequences of choices made in desperation. The vicar had quietly accepted transfer to another parish, carrying the burden of betrayal, but not its guilt. Eleanor Vance had transformed Mrs. Ashford's cottage into an honest workshop where traditional lace-making flourished without deception. Her pieces, while perhaps lacking her teacher's technical perfection, possessed something far more valuable, the integrity that comes from work performed with clear conscience and clean hands. As evening settled over Little Wickham, Miss Marple reflected on the intricate pattern that had finally revealed itself. "Poor Mrs. Ashford," she murmured, her needles pausing momentarily. A great talent, corrupted by circumstances, but seeking redemption at the last. Her hidden cache of authentic pieces was her final attempt to set the pattern straight. The church bells marked the hour with their familiar cadence, calling the community to shared worship and social gathering. Children played on the green where tragedy had once unfolded, their laughter a testament to life's enduring capacity for renewal and hope. Miss Marple gathered her knitting as darkness approached, her christening shawl nearly complete. Each stitch had built upon the previous one to create something beautiful and lasting, much like the gradual process through which communities rebuilt trust after betrayal. The delicate art of detection she had learned long ago required the same patience and precision as the finest lace-making. Each thread must find its proper place in the larger design of justice and mercy that made civilized life possible. The lace-maker's secret had been revealed at last, its intricate pattern of guilt and redemption fully understood. Little Wickham would remember this lesson about the complexities that could lie hidden beneath even the most tranquil surface, yet still maintain its capacity for trust, forgiveness, and the quiet satisfaction that comes from work well done and truth finally acknowledged.